I want to thank every Amazon employee and every Amazon customer, because you guys paid for all of this. So seriously, for every Amazon customer out there and every Amazon employee, thank you from the bottom of my heart very much. It's very appreciated.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Literary...
Jesus, bro.
God damn it. Hey, look, it's been a tough week.
Too many L's on your mind.
Yeah,
there you go.
Left Reckoning. I knew I was going to do it, too, as I started. Yeah, it's you, Amazon workers, who delivered Skittles into space. So Jeff could throw them around. David Griscom, how's it going, man?
Not too bad, man. I'm really looking forward to this episode. In a little bit, we're going to be premiering a conversation I had earlier with Lillian Cicerchia. I apologize, Lillian, if I didn't get that right, but I think I got pretty close, if not all the way there. We're going to be talking about a really critical book called Hegemony Socialist Strategy by Leclau and Chantal Mouffe that has influenced a lot of the left in the wrong way. We'll be breaking down the problems with the kind of post-class left and post-Marxism in general. A little bit later, we're going to be talking about what's going on in Topeka, Kansas, as workers are fighting for basic dignity, fair wages, and an end to what is called, it's a despicable name, what it's describing, the suicide shifts on the plant floor there. And also solidarity with all of the workers and drivers and gig workers across Austin, LA, and all across this country who have engaged in a one-day strike to demand better working conditions, and for Congress to finally get their damn act together and pass the PRO Act. Mm-hmm. And there'll be a lot more fun and good times in the post game. So definitely consider joining us over there at patreon.com/leftreckoning.
Yeah, I would say just quickly on the PRO Act, there is possibility that some of the penalties for employers could get through reconciliation. So it's worthwhile sending voicemails to the holdout senators. I think there's a few of them. If you want to do an action on that, that would be worth your time.
I mean, any arrow you can put in the quiver of organized labor is a good thing, y'all. That's really it. That's basic kind of Marxist politics, is understanding that this is a long game and we're trying to arm ourselves for a very, very, very brutal war.
Yep. So speaking of that war, we should also mention the 1 year passing of our former captain, Michael Brooks. Tough week. It hit me hard, I guess, to be frank. A lot of the feelings I felt the week of came back. The feeling of your reassessment of the concept of time, things like that, that just haven't gone. And then towards the end of the day, I was on my way back home from work, and I saw Megan Day, our friend, post this Jacobin piece. And I'll read a little bit from it. Ben Burgess does the preamble here. And I remember hearing Michael mention something about Esquire, but it was in passing. And so he must have maybe had a sense that they weren't going to like this. I don't really know why. We can maybe get into that. I'm not sure. But so Michael Brooks on why the war on the poor must end. 2 years after our late friend and comrade Michael Brooks wrote an unpublished piece about his family's experience with food stamps and Trump's assault on the SNAP program. We published it today. The anniversary of Michael's passing is a tribute to his memory. And then here's Ben. In August 2019, our late friend Michael Burgess was writing an article for Esquire magazine. He asked me to be an early reader on the piece, and even though I was on a cross-country trip at the time, I was excited enough that every time he'd send me a new version, I'd pull into a rest area to read it on my phone and send him comments. Esquire ultimately decided not to run the piece. My sense when I asked Michael about it later was that they were looking for something that was less ideological and more of a straightforward personal essay. That could be wrong, but I do know that it's a moving encapsulation of his humanity and his commitment to political change. We're running it today as a tribute to our comrade. And, I think, well, David, I'll throw it over to you, because I know that you and Michael talked about this a lot. You probably knew his mind on this better than anyone. Like, what was your reaction to that?
I mean, this was a really touching reminder of why Michael and I feel like had such a good relationship, because we both sort of recognized each other as people who had similar experiences growing up and knowing what it was like to sort of be on that kind of cutting edge of hunger, and specifically knowing how important programs like SNAP were for our families and, functionally for our survival. And this piece is a really wonderful piece, not only because Michael makes a very strong and principled point about the barbaric actions of the Trump administration, basically targeting SNAP, but he also hits at the devastation that we all experienced under Clinton, when you started to see those benefits drying up for folks. But what I really, really like about this piece too is that there are so many people in the damn political media who treat these things as abstractions, right? Oh, is this good policy or is this bad policy, right? And one thing that was so inspiring and powerful about working with Michael and learning from him was just always pushing forward the actual human experience there, right? Like, this is not just like a rhetorical question to talk about hundreds of thousands of people losing access to fresh foods, right? Those are families. Those are real people on the other, on the other side there. And it's just not thought about or really wrestled with enough by people. And Michael was able to do that without also getting lost in the moralism too. Do you know what I mean? Like, he was also able to make the systemic points. He was also able to make the kind of calculated points, but never, ever, ever lost the humanity. And that was why he was such an incredible communicator and somebody who was very important to learn from.
Yeah, this is an exercise of him doing it in their language. Really, like, we talk about standpoint epistemology, and I think like Michael does a great job of having a criticism of something, of the limitations of it, but also incorporating it into his worldview. And I want to just zero in on the final paragraphs here, because I think it's really eloquent. At the same time, though, what the woke college kids call lived experience really does matter, just as it's important that not all of the media figures who write about police brutality be white people who've never experienced racism. We need voices from a broader range of economic backgrounds covering issues like the Trump administration's assault on SNAP. These proposed cuts hit me personally, and that's a good thing. It helps me understand something far too many commentators miss, that this isn't just a matter of different politicians having different solutions to help us reach common goals. It's yet another front in this country's ongoing war against the poor. Yeah, and that's such a powerful point. It is also why, for example, he had such a strong critique of the bell curve and Sam Harris's obsession with that, right? Because functionally, what people like Sam Harris are arguing, therefore, are for providing different amounts of resources and opportunities to different communities, right? And that touches a lot of people. And it's not just like an academic debate about, what people got on IQ tests. No, this is a very clear and concrete example of like structural power being used to smash and to harm folks. Yeah, and it's interesting to dwell on why we don't get this perspective, right? Like, my experience with media, and I assume yours too, is that it is not. You should not expect a whole lot of improvement, particularly from like the major media in this organization on this front, because everything is stacked against people that can't have parents pay rent to do unpaid internships, or to get elite degrees. Look at any editorial board. Look at the education for those places, right? Like, it's all It's all people who have gone through elite education, and have the ability to pay for that. And like, yeah.
And then you don't know things. You don't
Yep.
know things about, for example, the food stamps or SNAP
Absolutely.
program, right? You don't know why they keep cold sandwiches by the hot sandwiches at the deli, right, at the grocery store, and it's because you can't get hot food. And there is so that means, by the way, those like nice rotisserie chickens that are a big part of many Americans' diets. It's a great thing to grab if you want to cook a quick dinner for your family. Well, you can't get the hot one if you're
Just
poor.
sick.
You have to wait for it to cool down, and then you could get one of them that they keep in the back, right? I mean, that, but also the recognition of the kind of the way that these programs were designed to make people feel shame and make people feel bad about themselves, and also help folks, sort of get by and try to portray a different lifestyle than the one that they actually are experiencing, because we don't have the kind of solidarity that we need in the society. I mean, Michael talks very clearly in this piece about, moments where some people made some really disparaging comments about, poor folk. And they were talking about him and his family. And, he was very sympathetic and saying, well, I know they weren't meaning this to hurt us, but obviously did. I don't know. Michael was just a real one through and through. And, never made anything about himself into some kind of like sob story, but actually took these things in a productive way to fight and to help out other folks. And it's just something that I find to be, I very much appreciate about him.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll all miss it. And, I think it's a model for everybody going forward, a lot of the way he viewed these things.
No, exactly. And I just would like to say again, from the bottom of my heart, year out, thank you to you, Matt. I love you very much. And thanks everyone in the community, because this has been what the hell? I mean, it's been something none of us could have imagined. But the kind of love and solidarity and, expressions of sadness that we're all sort of doing together have really, really meant a lot to folks, and also have really brought a lot of people in, as strange as that might be to say. I mean, I've been getting so many messages from folks over the past few days saying, I only knew about this after he passed away. But this actually still changed, like, learning about the work that y'all are doing at TMBS and learning about Michael, really benefited me and taught me a lot. And it makes me very happy that the work that he was doing is able to be captured in that way, that it actually still, you can still experience it and interact with it, because he's still doing the work.
I mean, yeah, he's going viral during key like geopolitical hot points.
Yeah, like in the Israel stuff. I mean, it's extremely, extremely powerful. And I was saying yesterday to folks that, sometimes I feel very blessed to be able to have this community, to be able to talk to all of y'all. But sometimes you can sort of forget how many people are out there like listening, and how much of a community there is, and how much love there is in it. And I know that Michael recognized it, but I think that he would be very, very touched to realize how deep that well goes.
Yeah, that's was always the most sort of mind-bending thing about it, is like, one, the first thing that always makes me appreciate that he got to interview Lula, and like the level of acclaim he actually was able to appreciate himself. But to see all those magazines who acted like our part of the little media doesn't exist, announcing his death, all of a sudden, like these places who would never cover anything, and all of a sudden they talked about him, because people, like, I don't know, it was like that whole, it's hard to, and it's seductive. Like there's a thing where it's like, I love having this community that to grieve with, and then it's like I could, like spend too much time going back and watching old clips and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, I mean that's something that's such a sweet thing to have. I mean, I was reminiscing about all the live shows.
Oh man,
and because those were just electric on a different level. But I just because these things this kind of subject matter doesn't always open itself up as much, I really did also want to note a couple of things that I really, really have grown to respect more uh, about Michael and what he was doing with us at TMBS, and the kind of lessons that he taught us, even if he didn't maybe intend to be teaching us how to be doing this stuff. In this past year, obviously, you and I have had to grow a lot, both professionally and personally, and really realizing how important his kind of like non-combative disposition was towards a lot of left questions. I think is something that a lot of folks could learn from, because it wasn't a pacifism, right? And as a general and like only principle, right? We spent like half of the show just shitting on people who we thought had really dangerous ideas, including people who considered themselves to be on the left. I mean, I say to people all the time, I don't think they realize like Michael's antipathy for the Warren crowd and that kind of like pragmatic socialist crowd that couldn't figure out who to support. I mean, it was very, very deep. He was very angry about all of that kind of stuff. And, so much of that, he was wanting to, I'm sure would still want to primary Elizabeth Warren, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Right. So I just want to remember him correctly, right? Michael wasn't one of these people who's like, never get mad, never call people out, never have like lines that you shouldn't cross, right? Yeah. But he also was somebody who said, very much believes, and I tried to echo this as much as I can, it's like politics just can't be your place for just personal self-expression. Going back to the food stamps, the SNAP story, right? It's because this is very, very real, right? And there's a lot of ways to express your kind of radicalness or how you're not cut from the same cloth as everybody else. But this is a space that we have to fight for our liberation. So all of the stuff that functionally is just about making you seem a little bit different from other people in your social circle or your cohort, he had no patience for that. And so much of people who do like, left media commentary stuff, it's all about defining yourself against other folks, right? Which was something that he was very, very much against. And I just realize a lot more now, not because we didn't have to make those calls, Matt, on TMBS ever. Right. But now we sort of do, like when you feel it, realize, okay, well, we're sitting this out, or we're not going to jump into this, or we'll find a way to talk about this without focusing on the personalities. You realize how incredible of a job he had been doing for years.
Yeah. I couldn't say it better myself. I think like that is the resounding message. It's the sort of thing where, all of a lot of the landscape now was what he was. When you see him on the night of that, the South Carolina primary, and how dejected he is, like he was fixated on exactly like this sort of micro splitting fragmentation thing happening, and it's like I you nailed it.
And a lot of people, they want to be right, they want to make the calls, they want to make the predictions. Michael didn't ride the cycle in that way. I mean, he made predictions. He was right, for example, about people should be taking Joe Biden a lot more seriously early on.
Yeah, absolutely.
But he was honestly, but those weren't like him just being a Benton man, right? Those were him like being like, please, let's figure out how to make sure that this doesn't happen.
Well, because it pointed to like a structural sort of like awareness thing. Like I remember when we were talking about, there's a whole part of the left was saying like Biden's going to lose because he's not like embracing Medicare for all, and like it's like, well, you need to confront the possibility that they might the face reality a little bit. And, I don't know, a lot of like flashbacks to little like conversations we've had have been coming through my mind a lot the last few weeks.
No, for sure. Well, there's definitely plethora of things that you can jump into, and I just have to say again, thanks so much to everybody. Thank you, Matt, and Michael Brooks. You'll always be with us in our heart. Yeah. Well, I want to in that kind of spirit, we're going to be jumping into a kind of broader conversation coming up right now with Lillian. I just want to set it up a little bit. I think we do a good job in the conversation. We're going to be critiquing a book called Hegemony and Social Strategy, that was written by Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe. Which we'll get into the history of it, but this is a book that's written in this kind of time when it seemed like communism, at least the way that most people understood it, was in full retreat, and the left was looking for different kind of answers to kind of classic questions of how do you build left power. And this book came out, and it was extremely influential. And I think this is an important work to critique and to understand, not just on its own right, but just because it's one of those things. I can't remember who said it, but it's like a philosophy is like never of its time, right? It's always like a little bit early. And this book very much like starts to anticipate a lot of arguments that would become popular. So these kind of ideas that the working class is not going to be like the subject of history. That's very much a discourse that we've seen even in contemporary American politics over the past few years. So understanding these and anticipating them and also critiquing them is very, 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 very critical. And I hope that this is of use for y'all, because, these kinds of big criticisms of like Marxism, right, that claim to be from within Marxism, so claim to be friendly criticisms, can be fairly seductive, especially for people who like to spend a long time reading and dealing with these kinds of questions. But actually really analyzing them and trying to expose them on their own logic, what that actually means for politics, I think is really critical, especially because we've seen where this turn left the left. And the left is in worse shape today than it was when they penned this book. And I don't think that this had any small role to play in that. So we'll be playing this, and then we'll be back for a little bit. Definitely also check out Lillian and her comrades podcast called What's Left of Philosophy, because it's a very, very good show.
Yeah, I just want to say I love this conversation, and we definitely need to have her back when we can both be there. All right, folks, we will see you on the other side of this interview for, we'll talk, Bezos and Branson. And,
Whitey on the moon, man.
Yeah. And then it's like little Lord Fauntleroy on the moon now. Not even halfway to the moon. We will see you then.
Welcome everybody back to Left Reckoning. I am joined today, I'm very happy to be joined today by Lillian Cicerchia, postdoc at the Free University of Berlin, studying and an expert in social philosophy. Did I get your name all right?
Yeah, it was fine. You're almost there, real close.
I'll work on it for the next time. Because for folks who aren't familiar with Lillian, she is the co-host of this really great show that you should be checking out called What's Left of Philosophy. I'm a big fan of it. I've been listening to it for a while now. It's a show where you can check it out on Patreon and all the other places that you listen to your podcast. And they have really insightful and accessible conversations on topics all the way from Althusser to dialectics, to Hobbes, and more. And I wanted to invite Lillian on today to talk about a book and two thinkers, Hegemony and Social Strategy, Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau. That it's a book that is very, very relevant for us to think about on the left today, because even though I wouldn't say that this is a book that is being equipped by many of our political opponents, there are ideas here that have really percolated throughout the American left-wing circles and certainly across Europe, and I think really need to be addressed and debunked. But before we get into all of that, how are you doing today, Lillian?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this. Well, let's introduce this a little bit. So this book is sort of important for me just because when I was at school, my last semester, I was able to take a course on Marxism, which was a really great course taught by one of my favorite philosophy instructors, who was actually a student of Ernesto Laclau. And reading Laclau for the first time was interesting just because of the way that it was sort of framed to me. I was reading this in 2015, and Ernesto Laclau had sat down with my professor all the way back in 2002, right when American intervention and neoconservative seemed to be the ascendant political movement, political philosophy. And Ernesto Laclau looks at him, he says, well, what's coming next is populism. And the next 2 decades are going to be decades of populism. So for that, I had always had this feeling, at least the way he was introduced to me, of these folks as people who really had their finger on the pulse of philosophy and politics. But this book, Hegemony and Social Strategy, which was written in 1985, really is politically, I would argue, a train wreck. It doesn't really lead us to where we need to go. They come up with all of these wild theories, including presenting themselves as post-Marxists. We'll get into all of that in a little bit, but I was wondering if you could, because I'm sure you'll do a lot better job of me, just sort of introduce the book, Hegemony and Social Strategy, for our audience and what they're sort of touching on.
Yeah, okay. So I think it's so interesting that you framed it in terms of somebody having read it in 2002, which was a period of like neoconservative hegemony, just to use their word, hegemony and socialist strategy, and that they were kind of anticipating a populist wave. I'd like to know more if we have time, just about like how prescient that was and what it meant to argue for the kind of thing they've been arguing for, especially still Chantal Mouffe is arguing for this kind of left populism in the context of that neoconservative moment, because I think it, like, how attractive these ideas are to you kind of depends on the political period in which you're reading it. Like reading it in 2015, when you start having a left-wing option like Bernie Sanders, rings kind of different than reading it in 2002 when there is no option and you feel like working at the discursive margins of the population and the polity is the best thing that can happen. So those are two different, like, these are either going to be compelling ideas or they're not going to be compelling ideas. And I think sometimes it has to do with whether or what is actually happening politically. So to introduce the book in its own context, in 1985, I think that the best way to understand this is it's post-Marxist, and we can talk about what that means, but importantly, it's post-New Left. So the New Left, there are lots of radicals, with all due respect, like they're people who were socialists, they were Marxists, they were expanding and experimenting with theories and the new social movements, but also in labor and so on. But there were these percolating criticisms of orthodox Marxism that began as early as the 50s and the 60s. As deindustrialization started to happen in the 50s, you got this fragmentation of the working class, the starting to weaken of some of the traditional anchors of working class power. And then you get these new social movements, the feminist movement, the civil rights movement, all kinds of stuff. And people started thinking, okay, the working class isn't the subject anymore. The Marxists think of the working class as a revolutionary agent, and it just seemed like they weren't. So for like 20 years, from the 60s until this book is published, the 80s, I think the best way to contextualize it is that it was the culmination of a 20-year period of trying to fill the gap that the working class had left. So the working class, for example, in the United States, the trade union movement becoming increasingly bureaucratic, conservative, took the no strike pledge during the war. There's a kind of home ownership, suburbanization thing going on. And so then you get students' movements, feminist movements, civil rights movements, and it just starts looking like, okay, maybe the working class wasn't it. Other groups might be it. And there was this search for the new subject. Like, for example, you can think about Sylvia Federici or Selma James, the autonomous feminist movement, where they thought maybe the housewife is like the revolutionary subject. Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism. Also, maybe the Black radical tradition, Black people specifically, are the revolutionary subject because they can reject not just capitalism, but the whole world as it exists. Third worldism had this character. The student movement, you can think about Marcuse. He was writing in one-dimensional man, like maybe not the working class, but the students, they can be revolutionaries. Okay, so by 1985, this causes fatigue. And Laclau and Mouffe write this book and they say, there is no revolutionary agent, period. So that, not only is there no class agent, there is no revolutionary subjectivity. Instead of thinking that there are these social groups that you can mobilize for whatever reason, or like the class in itself that you want to turn into the class for itself, there is no in itself. So yeah, does that, I hope that helps to.
No, I mean, it definitely does. And, and it's an interesting book because, again, it's supposed to be a book of social strategy, but from the get-go, there's very much a rejection of the kind of politics of Marxism, including some weird redefinitions of things. I mean, for both of them, class starts to become less of like an economic position as much of an identity, right? Which is why I find this to be very interesting to sort of read and critique today, because there is a kind of liberal discourse around like what being a working class person is, right? Things like people use terms like classism, right? Oh, it's like, oh, well, you like these kind of products, that means you're of this class, instead of it actually being the more scientific concept of like, do you sell your labor to a boss, right? So there are all of these redefinitions that are going on there. And it's because in my reading, they have a real unease with what they call essentialism or any proper definition for things, correct?
Yeah, I think that the primary argument is that the working class is not special. And we couldn't fill the gap that the working class left, which means there is no gap to fill. We are just fragmented subjectivities. And we are just trying to articulate ourselves with different kinds of symbolism and discourses. And this is always overdetermined. So you can never actually congeal a social group with common interests to do anything in particular, at least over the long haul. Not the way the trade union movement thought, okay, there's this group of people, they share interests, and we can try to get them to see that they have these interests in common, and then we can get them to work together. And then if they work together, they might form a collective political subject. The argument in this book is fundamentally that like there is to abandon the idea of this being possible as a durable project. You can only kind of articulate yourself in a milieu of other individuals contingently, symbolically, discursively. And I don't know, I think that the relationship to the idea of identity is very ambiguous in this text, but I think you can see why, why it fits so nicely into the identity discourse, because eventually at the end, what kind of group do you feel like you're a part of? Other people you identify with. And the reasons you identify with people could be a lot of different things. Like it could be race, it could be gender, it could be sexuality, it could be, just different cultural signifiers, anything really. And it's the instability of our identities, and that we're all just, that in order to kind of create cultural hegemony, we have to just pull them together just at different moments, at different times. And there's no system logic to this. It's just, we're in this constant project of contestation. And I think if you were to say, what does left populism mean? That's it. It's this constant contestation with other individuals, accepting that our relationships with each other are always fragmented and partial. I think it's worth asking why this is compelling and feels liberatory to some people, at least in the 80s or 2002, as you were saying, and why to some of us it feels like such a limitation on our political possibilities. But I think for a whole generation of people, this felt like, oh, thank God we don't have to worry about workers anymore. Like they seem stuck in the mud,
Yeah, no, I mean, 100%. And then also, I mean, it has to be noted too. I mean, we're seeing the decline of, of the communist world at this point too, right? This feeling that the great dream, the alternative essentially that was so unifying, at least earlier on for, leftists and socialists, had sort of disappeared. And obviously this is way past when, people heard about the horrors of Stalin. But, there's this crisis moment. And I do feel like that looms very, very large. That any time that you do have some kind of determination or some ideas like, okay, this is the working class, the idea is that once you define something, that everything outside of it like must be destroyed. And it's like that's a real sense of anxiety that you get with Mouffe and Laclau, right? Is that like you're authoritarian basically if you assert any kind of truth about society or any functionally like really any kind of definition about society either.
I think that it's the beginning of, or maybe it's the beginning of the end of a long process of the moralizing of structural positioning and causal relationships. So I think that, to be fair, the socialist movement did have a sort of like, workers are, there was a lot of optimism about what working people could accomplish. And I think like rightly so. There's also, I think, some moralism about, being the right kind of worker, the right kind of discipline, the right kind of virtue. If you look at posters from like the SPD or the KPD in Germany in the Weimar period, you've got these like virtuous, strong men, and they're like, so there's this way in which, morals and a sense of ethic and the importance of this particular group of people lends itself to like, we're the center of the struggle. But I think that the thing that matters more is why they might have thought that, which is the kind of structural leverage that these people can have over the people that dominate everybody in our society. And so I think what ended up just getting wrapped into this criticism of class politics is this conflating the idea that people have a set of structural opportunities and potential kinds of capacities to exercise leverage, create obstruction costs, and that you might be motivated to organize with one another for those reasons, with a kind of privileging discourse. Like, you think these people are more important, they're better, they're more virtuous, they're more ethical. And you can see why people would have thought this, but it's also kind of incredible that that really took over. It really took over for Laclau and Mouffe. Like the whole book is trying to assail the faith that people had in the workers' movement, trying to assail the idea that these people were special. And so there's these highly moralistic overtones that are kind of shocking, looking back on it. I find myself reading the text wondering, like, why do you hate these people? So,
yeah.
These are regular people who sorted themselves out into political parties and trade unions, and you have so much aggression towards how special we thought they were. But do you see what I mean? Like, where there's this kind of antagonism toward the center of the capitalist system?
No, for sure. And it is funny historically, and I want to save our conversation for sort of what's happened really in the past decade, because left populism really became a kind of, at least if you're reading publications like the New Left Review or Jacobin or stuff like that, that was a word that was used many times to describe a lot of different political movements I actually think had very different contents, from like Bernie Sanders to like Podemos to Syriza. I think that they're very different contexts, but they have similarities. But anyways, we can get into that in a moment. Because it's interesting though, the kind of disdain that you do get from them for the working class, right? Because like, look, there is this challenge at the end of the Communist Manifesto, right? Workers of the world unite. And I do think that it is fair to sit there in 1985 and look around and be like, okay, why did this not happen? But there are lots of arguments in the Marxist tradition that address this. I think it's not something that hasn't been considered, but I think it's fair game to look as to the historical reasons, especially in the United States, why there wasn't a strong workers' party that developed there. But it's so interesting though to read their kind of disdain for the working class, but also their attachment to the term Marxist, right? Because post-Marxist is a very funny way of framing their argument, because ex-Marxist would work just as well, right? But they really emphasize this idea that to get to our position, we had to go through the Marxist tradition.
You had to become more radical than it. You had to take the position within the academic and intellectual left as being the kind of tribune of what counts as left wing, what counts as radical. And there's a kind of saying among Marxists in the academy where basically everyone wants to be a radical, but no one wants to be a Marxist. No one wants to be a socialist. So there's this kind of important leverage that post-Marxism of this variety gets from Marxism, which is that it only counts as radical or left-wing because it has surpassed, superseded, or otherwise undermined, but the word has always gone beyond Marxism. This is very important because if you read this kind of text and you compare it with like just liberal sociology and the social sciences, like pluralist theories of the state, there are different interest groups and we are all vying for power within the state. We can have our lobbying groups, our NGOs, our nonprofits, our different constituencies, our community groups, and we are all just trying to create, influence the government to do what we want. And it's a free marketplace of ideas. So whoever wins that context will shape public policy. Well, it's pretty interesting that like, for the most part, that is what they think, that like, you just want to create your but they use different language. They use hegemonic block. Instead of an interest group, you want to create a hegemonic block. And the reason this seems like radical is because it's supposed to be going beyond Marxism. And so that's why Marxism remains important to post-Marxism. It's a way of positioning oneself. I'm not a liberal, I'm a radical, but I'm not one of the vulgar radicals. And I think that, if I can kind of speak to people, like if you go into an undergraduate seminar in the United States, this is very difficult to understand. Like when I entered the philosophy world, I thought that we were all just building on Marxism. Like I took a Marxism seminar with David Schweikart. It was called Marxism and Existentialism. I thought it was so dope. I was like, yes, this is how the world works, basically. And then I took other seminars on Foucault, on Nietzsche, and so on. And I just thought we were building. Like we were just getting deeper and deeper. We were understanding power better and better. And then at some point I realized, wait, the whole architecture of this is to undermine the theoretical foundation that Marxism laid, and kind of sneaks up on you that that's what's happening. And I think that's worth saying, that that's basically, in my opinion, that's kind of what the niche post-Marxism fills.
I would very much agree. When I first read this text, it was extremely disappointing for me, especially because of the way that the course was laid out. Is like, you start with Marx and you do Lenin and you're getting fired up, and then you get to the end of Marxism, and I was a double major in political science and philosophy, but it was really disappointing to finally get to the end of this book that's supposed to be the capstone of like the Marxist tradition. And essentially it felt like something that I would read in a political science course, which is, as you were just saying, how can we create new communities that are going to show up and vote for us? And at a certain point, you could maybe spend some time, taking apart some of their conceptions, but like take it at its best, and it almost becomes like a neutral system, right? Where it's like, this is the same kind of thing that Karl Rove is doing. When Karl Rove was like, okay, we're going to turn Texas red, right? He's like, okay, well, let's think about the different identity groups within the state that we can get to vote Republican, right? Like this doesn't seem very revolutionary or radical.
And interestingly, they're European, so it's kind of a different context that they're responding to. But when you think about the two-party system in the United States, like we think about them as being the left and the right, relatively in the American system. But American political parties are really just like conglomerations of ideology. Like if you think about the way that they've shifted over time, it's not a clear left and a right with a clear constituency and political project. It's actually like pretty interesting to see how they morph ideologically over time in a way that if you look back on like what the Whigs are doing and what the Free Soil people were doing, you know, just in, you're like, wait, how did all these people fit together again? And so like in the American context, there's a way in which these ideas about just the pluralism of it's intuitive to Americans because that is kind of how we already think about politics within our political system. We think about kind of engaging in like a two-polar hegemonic battle. We don't think about building a specific political constituency based on specific interests. And this is a very big challenge for socialists. And there's a reason why it's an argument that's so difficult to make, because it's not the way our political system works. So I think that if you're going to talk about the way this is received in the United States, I think it just, it seeps in a way that feels natural to a lot of people.
I know, absolutely. And that's an interesting point about the way Americans think about politics. I hadn't considered that before. I would like to, before we sort of broaden this out, so we don't get too far from the text.
Sure.
They do utilize Gramsci a lot, and in a way that you have said that, you know, on your episode on your show, it's a very strange kind of reading of Gramsci that they use.
Yeah. What was your impression of that? I'm curious because I think of opinions about the way that they're interpreting him and like leveraging his arguments, but I'm curious what you thought.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is so funny about the way that they use Gramsci is that they basically use him to sort of, you know, be like their backup on the idea that like societies are complicated, right? But they completely ignore the fact, you know, because that's basically fundamental to their argument, right? It's that using these kind of terms like bourgeoisie versus like working class, right, are unhelpful for politics because it completely obscures all the movements that happen in advanced societies, right? And they say, well, look at Gramsci. Gramsci says, you know, these kind of similar things as well. But Gramsci also can be very clear about the fact that Gramsci is hard to read, about that you do need to have these kind of totalizing conceptions for politics as well.
Yeah, you know, here's how I have started to think about this, the way that they talk about Gramsci. They utilize Gramsci as being he's the good Marxist. Like, there's the terrible, economistic, reductionistic, vulgar, technological, deterministic, these other second international Marxists, but Gramsci, he's the one, he got culture, he got the social, and not just the economic. And that makes him able to start thinking about hegemony as a cultural and discursive practice and not just the economic. And so they leverage Gramsci to basically go in this more like the politics of language and discourse and symbolism direction. And what I think is kind of fascinating about their use of Gramsci is the way that they use him and his attention to culture and the social to actually like kind of make the economic world this deeply antisocial, like strange, cold, vulgar place where nothing political or social actually happens. So you have this thing called the economy, and it becomes kind of nasty to talk about it, because apparently this is the realm of just like instrumental reason and mechanism and technology, and you know, this is so reductive. I think that what Gramsci, if I can, you know, I'm not the expert interpreter of Gramsci, but if I were to take a stab at it, since I don't think Gramsci ever questioned the importance of class politics for a minute in his life, I think he was thinking about workers as robust individuals. He was thinking about workers as having a world in which their working experience was integrated within. I think he was questioning the distinction between the social and the economic, and he was trying to understand how people were relating to this in his specific context. And so he was trying to break down the distinction between the economic and the rest of social life by understanding it specifically and concretely, which we all need to do. And they take this argument to say that the economic is almost not real or not determinative, and they think that, you know, society and the social is what's determinative and what matters. So they actually, instead of developing a more robust view that I think Gramsci was trying to develop of, you know, these real living people that go into the workplace, they have all of their ideas, they have their religion, they have their intimate lives, they have opinions and values, and you know, they're not just cogs in a machine, and he's trying to understand this. And they actually, instead of creating a less reductive view, they turn it in the other direction, and they create the most reductive view possible, which is that they aren't constrained by anything. These people are not workers, are not people who are dealing with complications and values and we're just going to turn this to the realm of language and culture, period. And so they present this to you like, we're going to have a more robust view of the social and political world. And it actually takes a turn in the opposite direction to a more strongly idealist and focus on culture and language. And you never get the integrated view that they and many post-Marxists insist that they're trying to give you.
That they're building. Yeah, it's very disappointing to see the development there, and where post-Marxism goes, because I do think, you know, pointing out certain tensions in Marxist philosophy is, you know, I'm not a dogmatist or anything like that, or it's like, you know, it's absolutely useful and worthwhile endeavor, but you don't really get it there, despite the really, really big claims. And, you know, it does seem, I mean, I'm fairly young, so I do not know what the feelings were like for academics in the 90s, but, you know, it was a dark time for folks to start talking and thinking through class politics. It really did feel, I mean, you know, we all know the cliches and the history, stuff like that, right? You know, that it did feel like there needed to be some kind of new synthesis or thinking about politics. But then the world really explodes, both through a new period of like neo-imperialism with the American adventures in the Middle East, and then with the collapse of the economic system that really opens up this kind of political door. And what a lot of people argue filled that gap was the rise of populism, right? Which, I'm just looking at the clock. That's one of those terms that it's like, I hate to even use it because, you know, people use populism and populist to mean so many different things. But maybe just to keep the scope of the conversation sort of contained, you look at a kind of revitalization of a different form of left politics, particularly in Europe, right? You see that with Syriza and Podemos, that is trying to do a different kind of politics that has some aspects of it that are very much like anti-capitalist, but they don't build those strong connections with the working class that would be traditional for socialist parties. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot in there. Like, if you were to look from like this past decade at Mouffe and Laclau, how would you sort of categorize their influence in politics?
Well, I think I'll go back to what I said at the beginning, that I would categorize it as a sort of solidification of a common sense that was emerging. So I think it's the break with the New Left that it took some of the New Left's criticisms of Marxism and radicalized them. And I think that is, we are still living in Laclau and Mouffe's world, where, and I think that what they do to break politics apart from material interest, the way that they make that seem vulgar and somehow exclusive and somehow focusing on only privileged people. I mean, it's a fascinating discursive development, but I think that is what has remained ideologically, where like we think about those sorts of topics as something separate from the other kinds of cultural articulations that are going on. So we think about these things competitively as opposed to in an integrated way. The other thing that I think is important is that instead of trying to find a way to congeal people into a collective political project, that lack of faith or the lack of interest or the lack of belief in that classical idea of a social group, class, or whatever in itself that can become for itself. They don't think that's possible. So they lean into the fragmentation, and they're like, actually, as I said, we don't need that. And if we don't need that, then we can shed the burdens of this work of doing world building. That I think the strength of the Marxist tradition was in doing that world building, like with trade unions and political parties. And contrary to what they try to tell you in the book, these were not just these weird technologically determinist worlds. Like if you read anything about mass trade unions in the United States, from the AFL-CIO to the SPD in Germany, people were going to clubs and they were dancing together, and they were going to church, and they had community centers. These weren't people who just thought that, oh, we could go to our meetings and then we're driven by the machine, and then we all have the same exact interest, and then we cast our ballots, and that's emancipation. These were people who understood that there are an incredible range of human values and orientations toward the world. And they understood that what they were doing was creating a world within a world that could act as a collective counterpower to what was oppressing them, to what was dominating them. They didn't assume that their constituency was all the same. They knew it wasn't the same, which is why they had to organize each other. And the lack of this common sense, the idea that any kind of unification or collective life is somehow intrinsically oppressive because you're creating sameness and hegemony, as opposed to, figuring out what you do have in common and what you don't, and how you can accommodate, learn to tolerate each other, learn how to balance your values in a space that, where you don't have to take that for granted. And that's why you need each other. That common sense of the old left is what Leclau and Mouffe killed. So if that's a little polemical.
No, I think that's great. I mean, like, let me just, paint a little picture, because like I spent a lot of time trying to talk to folks, because post-Bernie, everyone's coming up with the new solution, the new synthesis for what the left should do. And maybe I'm just like the cranky old socialist over here saying, like, okay, what we need to do is we need to start building strong working class organizations, right? And people like that might not be like the most fun answer, but I'll tell you, they're going to be much more vibrant than any kind of new political party that you're going to build in the United States. I'll tell you that right now. But the reason this is important, because I try to juxtapose, okay, so in the United States, we throw this Hail Mary, hope that maybe Bernie Sanders can become president. In his own theory, he said, if I come into power, I will not be able to shake the state enough on my own. I'm going to need mass mobilization, right? And people love that because they're like, oh, well, that's because he believes in us. It's like, well, yes, he believes in you. That's great. But he has a good understanding of what the state is and what it represents. Let me paint another picture of Syriza, right? Which was the coalition of the radical left. And again, some people, I have good, Greek friends, and people really tried. This was a real attempt. This is not me sitting here saying like, you idiots, anything like that. But this is looking at what happened in that history. Is you get this coalition that comes into power, right? Very radical, what they were saying was a radical break from neoliberalism, right? You can't really criticize the party platform there. But what happens when they come into power? The connections between the base and the party were completely severed. Leo Panich, who is somebody who, I reference a lot, makes this great point about how the education minister had this idea that they wanted to use high schools around the country to basically be workers' centers, right? To start building that kind of community and base within the working class. But there became a practical question when that came about, was that basically anybody who had any connections to the party had just been brought into government. Right. So they almost completely evaporated, and brought into power their like activist base, so that they didn't know who to call. Right. So the intentions even were there from the folks who controlled the state apparatus, but like the actual practical needs to implement what they want to do weren't there. And this is one of those, I bring this up because, look, I definitely think, arguing about policy and theory and stuff like that is crucial. But this is some of these kind of practical questions that, are definitely missing in Hegemony and Social Strategy, and also a lot of like left discourse around politics, right? Which is that there's so much fixation. It's like, okay, well, how do we break the capitalist, system, like through a certain kind of policy or plan or something like that, and forget that you need the mechanism to do so. And the real tragedy of the kind of left populist movement is, despite it was trying to uphold folks, and have like the image and the idea of people, it didn't successfully mobilize people to be able to implement any of the radical changes that it wanted to. And in MOOF and Leclau, it's even worse, because God forbid that system, like let's say their system actually works, right? And this kind of radical connection of, the chain of equivalence, of different groups comes into power, and then they're basically unable to do what they want to do, because the theory of the state and how to interact with it is completely absent. And then once you lose the trump card, which is the control of production that the working class can effectively leverage if organized properly, you sit in this moment where I just couldn't imagine a more demoralizing moment that, like, God forbid, let's say MOOF and Leclau, right? You whip in like this incredible coalition. Oh, they control Congress and the presidency, and it's time for a radical new day in America. And then functionally, you're not able to do anything. I would probably contend too that I don't know how anti-capitalist their philosophy ends up being, but you can imagine how demoralizing that would be.
And what a collapse of whatever kind of, like, what I think in regular politics is called political capital, but in their framework is called, like, a discursive articulation or something like that. Whatever political capital or discursive hegemony you've acquired on the way up, it's very easy. Like, that's the kind of thing that will collapse immediately when people get disillusioned by the fact that you can't help them. So the problem is that for people like post-structuralist writers like this and post-Marxist writers like this, domination exists, but we don't know how or why it exists. It just does, in a kind of force field of power. Power isn't something that you can amass based on structural leverage or a certain kind of social position or within certain institutions. It's a force field that you're just negotiating. So the idea that you would need specific institutions to give you structural leverage over your employers or against the state, to work with, even with and against the state. This is just not a part of the vision that emerges. And, I just want to add one thing about, this sounds crazy. Like, if you are somebody who's reading this for the first time after post Bernie Sanders, and you're like, wait a minute, like, we don't have the power to, like, make our elected, our democratic socialists, we don't have the power to make them accountable to us or to help them do anything. So, we're just, like, there's a problem of infrastructure here, and there's a problem of organization. These kinds of thoughts that, like, when you start thinking, how do I get power and keep it and push on it? These are the kinds of questions that don't occur to them, not only because they don't care anymore about having a social constituency, they also think about themselves as the social constituency. And I feel like this is a problem that kind of, like, you can critique the theory for what it is and how it talks about the world, but the more insidious part about it is that when you start thinking about power in such a fragmented, socially what's the word I'm looking for? Fragmented, socially dispersed way, the people who are capable of articulating the new discourse, well, they're academics and they're intellectuals. So we don't need a constituency because we in the universities are the constituency. And I think that the more polemical point is, like, how dare you? Like, when has that ever been true? So and there's this way in which they present the culture war almost as being something that they can wage from a position of strength because they're educated. So there's this ironic and uncanny way that they talk about populism. It seems populist because we're coordinating so many different interests. We're inclusive. We're bringing in the margins. But I actually think it's the opposite. I think they think that they're in the best position to wage the culture war. And I don't think that benefits anyone besides themselves.
No, I mean, that is a damning point, but you do feel like that, like, essentially that there's so many balls in the air, within their conception of populism that, yeah, only like the super intelligent, well-read academics would be able to hone, this kind of cacophony of sound in like one direction. And yeah, you can see why this is attractive to a certain group of folks. Well, I know we're sort of getting to our last couple of minutes. I don't know if this is an unfair question to ask you, so feel free to say you're unable to answer it right now. But if that is, a kind of negative version of, theorists and academics in relation to social movements and politics, how would you conceptualize, a role of theorists and academics who want to help out, the social movements and ideally the working class movements? Do you have any thoughts on that? We have a lot of folks who are sort of, trudging through their PhDs and their grad school years right now. So can you give them any hope?
No, so I'm just kidding. I'm working on this, to be honest. And I'll just try to explain with the little time we have left why I think it's complicated. And then maybe this is just food for thought for others, because I continue to think that theory is important. It's important for a number of reasons, so that you can develop a social theory of the world that you live in, so that you understand what you need to do to try to change it. That's the simplest way to talk about it. But you also need to be able to articulate a vision that's compelling to others. And so, this is why the field of, more like philosophy, not just theory, but, just what does justice look like? What kind of world do we want to live in? What does it mean to live in a free society? These are the kinds of questions that you need to ask in order to give a compelling vision of the future. And so it's important for these reasons to be able to navigate the political and cultural and ideological terrain, and to be able to have some consistency and focus, and to know what you want to achieve. And I think that theory plays an important role in that. I think philosophy at its best plays an important role in that. But at the same time, I think that people use theory in really different ways. And I think it's worth being super ambivalent about that, because, I'm an academic. I often get very frustrated with myself and my discipline and the universities and so on, because people think they're activists in this world. They think that there's this way in which they know there's the movements happening outside, but they're doing this work of social justice in the university, and it can become very narcissistic, very alienating, and very confusing. And I think this comes again from the New Left. When the New Left entered the academy, they did have experience in social movements, and they did think about themselves that way, and they bequeathed that to new generations of people. But as we know, there's a huge education gap in the United States. There's a huge gap between people with 4 years degrees and the kind of and people who don't have those and work other kinds of jobs. There's a huge cultural problem here. So I don't want to overstate what theory can do to change the world from that perspective. But there's another perspective, which is the perspective that people had some, previous generation ago, which is that they thought, Catherine McKinnon says this all the time. She's kind of a radical feminist, not a Marxist, but she talks about, feminism had a way of theorizing collectively to attain knowledge, to be able to figure out how to know a thing in order to do what they needed to do. And there was a kind of there was a collective endeavor to figure out what reality was like, and to be able to create a kind of epistemological narrative or theory to be able to give themselves the tools to clarify that and to continue to build. And I think at its best, when people are not being so academic about it, I think that's what it is for people. And I hope that from my side of things, people can attain some humility And I hope that people also aren't, intimidated by the philosophy and the theory, because at the end of the day, I think what we're doing is we're talking about justice. We're talking about needs. We're talking about values. We're talking about the good life. And I think everyone can be a part of that. And if we need, and if we want a better world, people have to feel empowered. And you start doing that by having an imagination, by being like, this is the world I want to see. And that's intrinsically theoretical, and it motivates people. And it can be beautiful if it's not so like, driven by professors. So.
Oh no, I mean, I hear you completely. I'm a first generation, went to school, and I was one of the only people from my neighborhood and community that went off to school. And I remember, working class community. And I remember going back, and I remember really first being exposed to Marxism proper. And all of these lights going off in my head that like all of these kind of family struggles and community struggles that we'd experienced and sort of, that you sort of put them in isolation, that they're actually very much connected. And that being an incredible moment of okay, I realized what the enemy is, but that was extremely powerful too. And then going back and being able to share that with friends and community members, of all different political persuasions beforehand, and really seeing those lights go off and realize, okay, all of this other stuff really doesn't seem to be as unifying as it was before. What really matters is that we're part of this kind of social class, this economic class, and we need to find a way to, fight for ourselves and get out of it. I'm very like adamant about this, because this kind of fight is always going on the left. It's like, should we do theories? And, and there's this kind of like straw man argument that people say like, oh, you shouldn't tell anyone they have to read books to come to political meetings. Well, no one's fucking doing that. I've never heard that, unless like by somebody who's just a psychopath, right? Like I've never heard that kind of argument in any like real sense. I understand what some people are allergic to, but these are our tools. They're tools that can help us get free. And also don't put yourself in a position where somebody else is doing all the thinking for you. That's why any good socialist party, Marxist organization, the first thing that they did was do political education, not just, as a kind of trial process, but actually so that everybody was equipped to understand what they were doing, why they were doing it, and also to prevent it being a situation where one person is just able to lord over everyone else saying, I've read the holy text and I get it, and you don't.
Can I say one last thing about this? That the feeling that you're describing about the light that went off in your head, and the feeling of like, I get this now, I can do something about this. I think that when you talk about a theory that actually reflects reality, and there's a feeling of joy and like an affect of like, I understand myself better now, and I understand myself better in relation to other people. And it makes, I know the word empowerment is kind of cheesy these days, but I think it makes people feel it's empowering. And I think that if you look at the major political organizations throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, not just in like the trade union movement, but also all of the like civil rights organizations, Black Power organizations, they all had their discrete and independent reading lists, and they fought about what reading lists they should have, and so did the feminist movement. So there's a way in which, here's how you know the difference in a certain sense between a good theory and a bad theory, and it's whether or not it makes people feel empowered. And I'll tell you one thing, when people read stuff like Hegemony and Socialist Strategy and a lot of this post-structuralist stuff in their activist groups or in their meetings, the way you know that this isn't a good theory and that it doesn't work is that it does not make people feel empowered. It makes people feel anxious, paranoid, unable to find direction, like defensive and like worried about each other, about connecting with other people. This is not what, like, that's the opposite of what theory is for. And it serves academics well. It serves, people, the opinion making class very well. But if it served working people well, we would know by now, and it hasn't. So,
Yeah. No, I think that's a perfect way to sum it up. For people who are interested in, even more conversations on hegemony and social strategy and a lot of other interesting texts and thinkers and theories, definitely check out What's Left of Philosophy podcast. I listen to it all the time, and definitely we'll put links and stuff for people to be able to follow you, Lillian. Definitely check her out. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks for having me.
All right. Oh. We are back. That was exceptional. One thing I want to follow up while it's fresh is that part about does theory make you feel empowered? And also to kind of excuse myself for misnaming the show at the top. Why literary concepts are on my mind is reminds me of this book, Regeneration Through Violence, the mythology of the American frontier. And see if this sounds familiar, just instead of mythology, talk about theory. So the ultimate source of myth is the human mind itself. For man is essentially again, this is 40 years ago, so it said man. A lot of that. He in subsequent
We'll forgive them. Yeah,
exactly. Well, I just wanted to point out in subsequent books in this series, he corrects that. So just give Slotkin a little bit of credit. He naturally selects to understand his world in order to control it, and his first act in encompassing this end is an act of the mind or imagination. On the basis of limited finite experience, he creates a hypothetical vision of a universal infinite order and imposes that hypothesis on his perception of the phenomenon of nature and his own behavior. He tests his vision by acting in accordance with the principles and behavior that seem to be demanded by reality as he envisions it. Insofar as that behavior is consistent with the universal order, it will seem to prosper him and acquire the name of virtue. Aside from its function as a guide to behavior, his vision is regarded as a source of power, since it tells him how to propitiate and control the forces that order the world. And then this is the key. Thus, myth visions, which are generated by the mind, ultimately affect both man's perception of reality and his actions. And then here. Myth describes a process credible to its audience by which knowledge is transformed into power. It provides a scenario and prescription for action, defining and limiting the possibilities for human response to the universe. So, like, I think kind of what you see in theory, like, that's exactly why I am so interested in the mythology of this country, because it does need to, it helps you understand how to order and change your world. And if it doesn't do that, I mean, it really hits the nail on the head. And you see so many pathologies that I think, like, that's a really dense interview, but a lot of, like, that whole crisis explains a lot of this.
And I mean, just speaking to the hegemony and social strategy, and Lillian makes this point very well, that it really is such an academic way to view the world, right? That, like, well, so there's essentially like infinite complexity and infinite tensions within any kind of conception of reality. So we can't come up with terms or conceptions that are able to be like politically motivating for us in like a universal way, but they can only be very, very fleeting. And every time they're composed, they have to be recomposed again. I didn't get to bring this up because I didn't want to belabor the point with her, but it is one of those things. If you look at their conception of politics, Jesus Christ, it'd be exhausting. Every year you have to recompose like the social formation to be able to take and maintain power, right? There really is not a kind of conclusion that is able to stand on its own two feet there. It's just a constant. I mean, and Chantal Mouffe, like in her later work, very, very much like lionizes this as like the benefit of their theory. But beneficial to who, you start to ask, and it seems more and more a certain kind of academic.
Is this a reason, in your opinion, to defend the C word communism?
I'd say so. I mean, how do you mean that?
Like, even like as opposed to socialism, like to emphasize communism more as opposed to socialism.
That's one of the, honestly, in the sense of like communism being like a motivating philosophy. Yes. Yeah. Right. Like, in the same way, like, I know you and I are both very fond of like the Oscar Wilde interpretation of socialism as being a utopian philosophy, in the sense of like, this is something to aspire and to be hopeful for. There is a lot of liberation in the communist hypothesis, that there is a potential to sort of alleviate and eventually overcome these social tensions, which you don't get from liberalism. And if you're really talking about tackling these massive problems that we have in society, and like if you have a mass mobilization thesis for how to do politics, you gotta have a utopian vision or an inspiring vision. If the word utopia is unattractive to you, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, there's definitely that. And I think sometimes even Marxists who are like, especially Marxists who spend a lot of time dealing in theory, miss painting that picture, right, of what we're doing, right? Like you can do you can do really great analysis, but never forget that we're fighting for a better and fairer and more human world. Yeah, but I was really happy though to like make these criticisms of their theory, but do it in a way that wasn't going to turn out to be like, oh well, this is why books are bad, or like having grand theories of society are bad. It's actually reclaiming them in a way. It's like, this is what happens in their absence, right? Just kind of like long-winded defenses of the status quo, because really, and I said this during the interview, but you read Hegemony and Social Strategy, and there's this moment, especially towards the end, and you just start to think to yourself, it's like, wasn't this just like what every political party operative is trying to do? Like, is this a socialist theory, or is this just a kind of basic like, okay, well, this is how like politics work in a democracy, right? You have to get a lot of different groups to show up for your person.
Yeah, and exactly. Like, I think it is important to. It reminds me of the Andrew Hartman point. If people just check out for patrons, we put this up on the Culture War. We'll probably release this publicly at some point. The way that like these what we see in the university system, as far as like certain specialities for study, were demands by activists, and a lot of those early scholars were activists. But it's interesting, the point about kind of bequeathing it to academics and losing actually that connection to it, because that's the rub, really.
Well, it's most interesting, and I'd love to get Nando on maybe to talk a little bit more in depth, or maybe another guest in Spain are very familiar with what's happened in Spain the past few years. But Pablo Iglesias, the former, now he stepped down, but the former leader of Podemos, right, which was someone we were all rooting for, Podemos, when that formation first came forward. He was an academic. He was a teacher. I can't remember the University of Madrid where he was a professor at. And he was a disciple, a student of Chantal Mouffe. In fact, like there are photographs of him like holding up Hegemony and Socialist Strategy is like, this is what we need to do.
Wow.
So it's interesting to see like what the Podemos moment was. It's like I mean, I think I was a little bit more optimistic than Lillian on like the practical applications of what they say in Hegemony and Social Strategy, in the sense like, you can try to formulate a movement, and one of the real tragedies of what happened with what we could maybe call left populism, and again, we tease this all the time, we should definitely just do a big, maybe similar kind of conversation on what that term means. But to be easy right now, like the left populist movement, especially what you see in Europe with left-wing parties that were different from the traditional social democratic parties, rising up in this moment of crisis. And now we're looking at them in 2021 and wondering what the hell happened, right? There was incredible moments of like mobilization. It did seem like something was going to break. And in all of their avenues, I mean, there were successes and people worked really hard. I'm not dogging folks in the same way that I wouldn't, in the same way that we lost here with Bernie, right?
Right.
It's not like an attack on anybody, but it's saying, okay, well, there are serious questions we have to ask about mass mobilization against the status quo, a crisis in capital. And now we're in 2021, still sort of sitting outside of power and figuring out what to do. The left populist movement that was really influenced by like Mouffe and Laclau, it is really interesting because they were motivating in a lot of ways. But when it came time to, when they came close to power, even in power in Syriza's case, the ability to deal with the state and to do what was needed, it just wasn't there. And I think that comes out of, especially in Podemos's case, a kind of very different conception of politics, even though they spoke against capitalism and spoke for the workers. it wasn't a through and through workers movement.
Yeah, that would be great. We probably do have Nando on. Should we let's talk a little bit. I think we could frame this little Bezos Branson segment as a Jen Psaki segment. Also, I don't know if you saw this clip of her characterizing it from the podium of the White House.
Oh, let's see it, man.
Okay, you're gonna like this.
This is a moment of American exceptionalism. That's how we see it. It will be the ingenuity of all of our commercial partners to help us continue advancing to the next stage of our nation's space exploration. And investments in space create jobs, can improve life here on Earth through climate monitoring and medical advancements, just to name a few. This is a moment of.
Yeah, I mean, Bezos essentially doing something that was done 60 years ago by the Soviet Union is an example of American exceptionalism.
Yeah, going up there with Skittles this time and throwing it at a teenager.
And I don't know, maybe I don't know what your exact feelings are on this, but I'm not down on space exploration and all this kind of stuff. The real problem with the Bezos and the Branson thing is that you have individuals right now operating at a similar level that states were doing 60 years ago. So you're not breaking through, right? And this is not like a new thing. It's not the first time we've gone into space. We've just underfunded and let these systems unfortunately rot in the United States. And this is not some kind of breaking moment or with anything other than the fact that private corporations can now do what governments were able to do a few years ago.
Right. And these guys are auditioning for the future. This is very important infrastructure for the future. Elon's on there too, right? And it's not Elysium fantasies. This is military industrial infrastructure. I mean, it is true that space is important for climate stuff. I think we mentioned last week that, for instance, Amazon deforestation is monitored by satellite, and during the sorry, excuse me. And Bolsonaro completely wrapped up all of that sort of enforcement, and I don't really see this isn't theoretical. That happened already, right? These two guys aren't really. I guess I don't know what their position on Bolsonaro is particularly, but they're right. But if people, there probably is worth a Google, actually, now that I think about it.
No, I mean, but it's such a joke. And I know people, I noted this last week and people have been noting it again that, Branson bumped a climate scientist talking about the Amazon. And, the U.S. media has spent more time talking about Bezos' space trip now that they did covering climate change in an entire year.
Yeah.
I mean, if it was so despicable when Bezos was going on about how him going up into space, right, and his personal exercise of resource waste, reminded him how important this planet was.
Did you see the Vic Berger edit to this?
Oh no, please share that with me. Okay. I haven't seen a good Vic Berger in a while, man. That's a throwback.
I know, man. It honestly it makes me feel so good.
I watch him on Office Hours, but I haven't seen a good Vic Berger edit in a while.
This is the instant classic, honestly. Here is the Bezos Bros.
Right in the middle of the most intense 5G section, they asked me how I was doing, and I was like, "I'm doing okay." So it was pretty intense. I was like, "I'm doing okay."
So you're just looking out, and that was probably the most profound thing, was looking at the Earth's atmosphere and seeing how teensy it is. Did you feel that? It's life-sustaining and teensy. You look at this thing, and you see how small you are. You see that the world is big. You see the atmosphere is small and teensy. This world is full of not enough unifiers and too many vilifiers. And when you get up there, you see that we are one world. This is one planet. We should have a lot of unifiers.
That fucking unifier rant, man.
No, I mean, the thing that's such a shame is, look, I don't know. I doubt that it will ever be something I'll experience in my life. escaping the Earth's atmosphere. But Jesus Christ, how much is it wasted on somebody like Bezos? So, and what I mean by that is this guy is coming back down. This has been a much publicized event, and he comes back down to earth, and he has nothing to spout off about this other than like the cliches. Like, I could do a better Bezos exit interview, right, about what I learned from going up into space than he did after actually genuinely experiencing that. And I really just think, I mean, that's not the biggest tragedy of all of this, but man, that is truly a waste to spend that kind of experience on somebody who's just not going to have the ability to appreciate or articulate it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was listening to the Eat the Rich podcast, and they were talking about Richard Branson. And I didn't know how he got his sort of start, but they made the funny point, which is very true, which is that if your grandfather has a Wikipedia page, you might be wealthy.
That's probably a good point.
But his dad was a lawyer for the entertainment industry that argued a famous case on behalf of the entertainment industry that said, we control talent regardless of if they do stuff here or in other countries, regardless of like whether the contract says or whatever, right? Like basically a discipline the talent sort of decision. So that's where this guy comes from. Like just a complete little like creep that like had rich parents and created a record store and like hit their lottery, and now he gets to like fly a plane off another plane. To go slightly, like honestly, like it's cool how high, I guess, like to probably, I imagine like floating in the air is cool. Floating in the water with a snorkel is cool too. Like you can feel weightlessness. That's not entirely like, and also being up that high, like I've been on planes. I remember my first experience on a plane, like in high school, thinking like, this is fucking very cool. I've got this. And we went to the fucking moon. Like, was it just NASA that was at Mars, like with a rover? Which, like, I don't know if we want to even go into the ethics of like contaminating Mars with shit like that. But that's cool. Part of me thinks that's really awesome. That wasn't Elon Musk doing that, right? Like,
yeah, and I mean, like the fact is that the space that's opened up for these guys just goes from like. I was talking to some people in the know who, NASA experience and stuff, don't share our politics. So I was just I was being a little careful, just trying to get information from them and their perspectives. And they made the point that, like, NASA has always used private organizations to produce and to, for its missions. But one of the big differences now is, I mean, it's complete top-down corporate here, right? There is no kind of social goal or even value for what Bezos is doing right now. Yeah, and that is a huge difference. And the privatization of NASA has lined a lot of folks' pockets, and this was a kind of internal battle within the government. But there were people who were lobbying for this within the United States, like federal government, who also were taking long positions for companies outside of the traditional ones to basically fill in the gaps of
That's what this is. This is about like trying out. This is tryouts for the near space oligarchs, basically.
And meanwhile, I'm sorry not to be too much of a tanky on here, but meanwhile, China is just opened up they just approved the first branch of the Chinese Communist Party in space at their space station, which name I cannot remember for the life of me right now. But there are other societies that are very much kicking our ass when it comes to their capabilities to explore the universe. And it's a shame, this next chapter, I think, that we're sort of sprinting into, because it doesn't seem like there's any political will for us to go into a space race with billionaires. I think that more and more what you're seeing from folks, as what we opened the section up with, was the Biden administration talking about how this is a great example of American exceptionalism.
Yeah. It's interesting. Like, I agree with that. That's just my sentiment. Then an IMer came in and said today that MR that he's sick of Democrats whining about Jeff Bezos going to space. And I'm like, they're not. They're applauding it. Adam Schiff is saying, knock me down with a feather.
If they're counting Bernie as a Democrat.
No, but Adam Schiff, dude, had a tweet today saying we should raise taxes. I mean, like the most transparently, like his commitment to raising taxes is like I love to see it. Right, exactly, right. But there's something different going. I think they're really trying to push this, and I want to share this tweet too from just fucking ABC News because these major outlets, man, like they are absolute just. Talk about the CIA.
Let me see what's on the New York Times.
This is ABC News. Look at that view, right? Like, this is embarrassing. Like, first of all, that's not attributed to anyone, right? That's just a sentiment they're attributing to this fucking 540p shitty ass webcam that they, I guess, at the last minute primed in to put on so they could have some sort of propaganda. Like, they're not even doing the propaganda right for this thing. It's Jeff Bezos throwing a Skittles at some 20-year-old, and then this shitty view that frankly doesn't look a whole lot different than what people have seen flying over the ocean if they've done that.
Yeah, it's a shame, man. I don't know. Maybe there's something that I've always, ever since a kid, obviously, being an astronaut would be fun. And as I've grown older, you think about the people who populate NASA, and there is something that is, and of course other countries do it, so this is not a unique American thing, but there is a kind of beautiful Americanness to the fact that a lot of these kind of country folk and Southern people especially, just go and they fly damn rockets out into the universe. It's cool as hell that these things are, being commanded from Texas and Florida. And, there is that kind of spirit there that I will say I'm very, sympathetic to it and moved by. And it's sad to see it sort of be overtaken by, all hat, no cattle cowboy like Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, exactly. Did you hear what he said? We need to move all heavy industry to fucking...
Yeah, we'll move all of our cars into space.
Oh my God. Just spouting off on shit and honestly thinking it's genius. And it's
we've already done a segment on Jeff Bezos's movie or entertainment suggestions.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm going to be... I'm not going to have very much patience to hear about what he thinks we need to do about climate change.
Yeah, I mean, it's just but this ABC News shit really pisses me off. Sort of the way it's trying to cultivate this, because there is resistance to it, right? Elon Musk is some people don't understand that space represents hope, right? We talked about that. And
it sucks so much.
And it's he wouldn't need to say that if there weren't enough people saying this is fucking dumb, dude. This is what the hell are we? I mean, also I want to say you raise taxes, and also these motherfuckers don't get to decide space priorities anymore. And
that's it. I mean, that's exactly our space priority right now is space tourism. Right?
Unbelievable.
Yeah, which is what the people are clamoring for.
Yeah. Well,
should we do this this shout out real quick? We got to do our strike shout out.
Oh, absolutely.
The post game. Do you have the link to the story handy?
Yeah, labor notes here.
Yeah. So I'm sure folks know there is an active strike right now going on in Topeka, Kansas, at a Frito-Lay factory. So continue, and there's been a call for a boycott. So continue. To not buy Frito-Lay products in the meantime. But I just want to talk a little bit about this. If you could scroll down a little bit, Matt. This is from a little while ago, but it sort of sets the stage here. This is from is it Dan DiMaggio? Yeah, yep. Dan DiMaggio's piece in Labor Notes. Frito-Lay workers in Topeka, Kansas have been on strike since Monday over low pay and forced overtime. Some workers have been forced to work 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week for weeks on end due to short staffing. They want to see that change. Nobody I know loves Frito-Lay enough that they want to live there, said a monk. I apologize. I'm not going to go for that one. The last name. A box drop technician responsible for keeping the plant's machines supplied with cardboard. We want to go home and see our families. We want to have our weekends off. We want to work the time that we agreed to work, and hopefully not much more than that. And what they're responding to and laying out here, and one of the main focuses of the strike, is what they call suicide shifts, where people who are working shifts, you know, from 3 a.m., 3 a.m., you know, to essentially, which is supposed to be 11 a.m., and they're being called in as they're leaving and asked to work extra, work overtime. So much so that there are even reports of people working from 3 a.m. to 7 p.m. All right. That is not a way, that is not a work schedule that you can organize a life around. And they are aptly named, right? That is the kind of thing where you are sacrificing yourself to the needs of the company. And later on in the story, they interview an individual who has been like going through these suicide shifts, and they said, I went to sleep. I didn't need, they're talking about being forced to work essentially on July 4th. I went to sleep. I didn't even hear the fireworks. I was so tired. I've had to miss going to so many holidays because I'm getting forced. I've had to call my mom and tell her I couldn't make it. I don't want to miss those, right?
Jeez.
And that's exactly what this company is forcing people to do, is choose between having a life, and we're not even talking about the kind of typical like work-life balance, like, you know, just being able to show up to the kind of basic things that most people expect, but also just having a life outside of work, because the way that these schedules are set up, people are basically going in, going home and sleeping, and then coming back.
Yeah, I mean, literally flipping the 8-hour workday, the 8-hour not workday. And to the extent, like, just to counter like the propaganda that the Frito-Lay bosses push, which is like only this amount of percentage people do that. Like they're definitely like gonna have a lot more than just like that extreme suicide scenario going on, right? And the point is, you're seeing a labor stoppage and actual suicides of your staff. It's disgusting. Like,
no, and the individual who they interviewed at the beginning of the piece, Drapo Stewart, said that they've only gotten a 77-cent increase over the last 12 years of working there.
Jesus.
And I wanted to talk a little bit about the structural nature of this problem, right? Because other facilities in the area, and we can put the piece away,
Yeah.
you know, other facilities in the area pay much, much better than this Frito-Lay facility does, right? So what's going on here is the company is refusing, and has refused for a long while, to provide adequate wages and benefits to their workers, right? And what they need to do to maintain that system is force the workers who they already have to extreme working conditions, right? I want people to understand that this is not just, oh, you know, the boss is just being mean like this week. This is what happens. These are the kind of decisions that are made by people at the top of corporations to say, okay, well, we don't want to pay all of our employees like a fair wage, right? And we don't want to pay them attractive benefits. So what we'll do is we'll find folks within this organization who are very, you know, are extremely marginalized and squeezed, and force them essentially, right, by using the threat of homelessness, of not having enough food, of all of these other constraints that are put onto us by society. We're going to use those constraints and those fears that people have to encourage them to push themselves to extra human capacity, right? Just so that we don't pay people a basic fair wage. These things, we got to understand this as a class and as a movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is not just like, oh, some kind of like, oh, it's just a miser at the top. Of course they're miser, and of course they're bad. But this is a calculated decision. Okay, we can continue paying bad wages because we can squeeze some people because of the threats that they have on their life, right? The needs that they have, right? That's the decision that's made by them. And that's why it's so fucking important to have union brothers and sisters to be able to say, all right, we're going on strike. And from what I've been reading, the tactics against them have been extremely nasty. They've apparently been sending in buses. You'll like this, Matt. they've been sending in buses, right? To break through the picket line, which they're these big like charter buses, which sort of imply that the company is bringing in hundreds of folks to go in and work. But people have been noting that there's not really much, smoke coming out of the smokestacks. Which means there's probably not much is happening. And it's basically like a psychological tactic to make it sort of seem like all of these people are breaking in every day to show up and work and replace you. But people have been saying that they don't think it's the case. But yeah, I mean, they voted down, I think, already one contract that didn't meet their needs.
There's another one that just today, I think they're going to vote on Friday.
Another Frito-Lay plant?
Yep. No, another contract offer submission by the bosses.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely, keep tabs on that and follow up. I mean, it's an inspiring moment. It's never an easy time to strike and to put yourself at risk like that. But it's always beautiful when you can do that. And again, please help maintain the boycott of Frito-Lay products until their needs are met.
This is that, like stressing like that this is a calculated decision, and they know like they're grounding people into it. There's a reason like you keep seeing at these strikes workers saying we're not robots. It's because like what they're being asked to do isn't sustainable for human life. And like we've seen with Amazon, right? They're just burning through workforces. And I mean, just like, like it's a like a more distributed version of this is maybe a bit provocative, but like the way Werner von Braun, the Nazi rocket scientist, used slave labor to build the rockets in Germany, right? Like, and it's like that he's going around and thanking the fucking workers, saying at the beginning we play this at the cold open, like, and people had like the response, they laughed at him because it's laughable, and it's like, and then like the weird moment of like, oh no, but seriously though, like. Really,
look how much wealth
people.
Look how much wealth Jeff Bezos stole from his workers. That not only is he able to live a lavish lifestyle and have a big ass house, but the dude's able to shoot himself off into space. I mean, it's laughable in a kind of cynical way, just laughing at the world on fire kind of thing. For Jeff Bezos to thank the workers, but if you do note, if you watch the clip, he thanks the workers once and he thanks the customers twice. Always the kind of skeevy salesman.
Oh god damn. Yeah, well folks, we have some fun stuff on the post game. We got Pitbull talking about Cuba, and he loves what you do, and even though it frustrates him, just keep doing what you're doing. Really, just I love it. I genuinely love it. Tim Pool talks about feudalism.
Oh hell yeah. Big
exactly. The French Revolution gets invoked. We're going to talk about Biden saying capitalism is alive and well. Might be right. Also there's a magic carpet ride. I don't know what you think about like fairs and like the sort of traveling ones where they have like Ferris wheels and stuff like that. There's a video here we might need to watch and discuss. And
my stepbrother worked at them, and they are as much of a scam as you think they are.
Man, I gotta say, like, we're having to discuss. The question I want to ask is like, am I getting too psyched out by like reading about people skirting regulations to like enjoy life? And this video, I'll just say, like, I'm not going onto a thrill ride that isn't extremely insured or something like that, because this stuff is insane. And it's also a story of triumph of man over machine. Anyways, so that's our show for tonight, folks. Thank you.
All that and more, and join us at the postgame patreon.com/leftreckoning. Matt, could you plug the Sunday show for folks too, for patrons?
Oh yeah, Tomas Kennedy. We're going to be talking about Florida. He's been described by DeSantis as an agitator. He's active.
DeSantis, the tribune of the working class, apparently. That's some wacko. Is that?
Wait, that's a thing?
Yeah.
I don't know what kind of working class. I think they're like the make fake IDs class.
The $75,000 a year Dodge Ram.
I don't know. Maybe I don't want to be anti-Floridian, but I see DeSantis and I think like this guy represents like the people who make fake IDs and also like use it to blackmail teenagers. That might be. I'm not saying about DeSantis, but anyway, that'll be for patrons. We're going to get into Florida and COVID and look. I hate Fauci. I always need to preface anything like this. But you come out with "Don't Fauci my Florida" shirts, you better not have another fucking wave of COVID. Is
Yeah.
all I'll say. So we'll be talking about that. And yeah, patreon.com/Left Reckoning to get that stuff, folks. Again, we mentioned earlier, but you've made it a lot easier to manage what's been a pretty horrible year on a lot of fronts. Yeah, I can't thank you enough without making this a very strange show. Yeah, we'll start in about 20 after 10, 9:20 Central Time, and until then, we will bid adieu to our public audience. See you, folks.